In one tree I find more than I could unearth, a lifetime well spent. Our eyes are not wide enough for the wonder of this world. Matthew Stanley, who also works at Samsara Diagnostics, has given us a wonderful poetry collection titled Every Sunset is a Moonrise. It is full of wonderful prose, also fascinating writing on the history of Japanese thought and the formulation of Japanese poetry and various genres. And Mr. Stanley himself has given us some magnificent poems to reflect on and think about. Just in this one I read, there's so many words. You read it. In one tree I find more there than I could unearth. The beauty of these poems, and he talks about this when he goes through his collection, is on the idea of, in Japanese, poetry is at its best when it's finding a certain depth to everyday life, a certain continuation that is precisely possible in an infinite sense because things are not complete, because they are always becoming something new. And I think this poem gives us a great example of this. So when he says, more there than I could unearth. Unearth is a beautiful word to use because it suggests dig up. We can't, in one tree, dig up everything there is about it. But that also means I cannot deform the tree. I cannot make it something that is not of the earth. It is always, in a way, sacred. And then when he says our eyes are not wide enough for the wonder of this world, this would suggest a kind of grace precisely because we cannot unearth the earth. We cannot reduce it to our ideas. We cannot dig it up and thus kill it, like digging up a flower to get at the roots, which is the very act that kills the flowers. So this is just one example in this one prose of a very well-placed word that brings out an entire deeper meaning to the prose. And it's also just beautiful to think our eyes are not wide enough for the wonder of this world. And I think many of the poems that Mr. Stanley puts forth plays on this this line of limitation being invitation. Because our eyes are not wide enough for the wonder of this world, that would mean there was always wonder in this world for our eyes to take in, to go explore. And definitely the theme of finitude is a work that comes out in this collection very well. I love, it's on the front of the cover, faith, poetry, and finitude. But the way that Mr. Stanley explores finitude is much more profound than simply saying it's the opposite of the infinite. In fact, the finite is the condition of the infinite, in that the finite is what infinitely becomes anew, unfolds. The incompletion of the finitude is why there is movement, why there is activity, and it's not spurious. Hegel will talk about the difference between spurious infinity and true infinity, and what Mr. Stanley is putting forth is something like a true infinity, because it is the ever relation of ourselves with a thing, not merely additions to a list. And I think that's brought out here because Mr. Stanley would have us stay on one tree. He does not say in many trees or from tree to tree, which would be the risk of the spurious, but in one tree I find. And I think all of his poems here invite us into that kind of meditation upon one particular tree. And that, again, would speak to Hegel. We find true infinity like a circle, where it's ever relating to itself, and thus is a true infinity versus a list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And really, a lot of the Japanese thought, and he also will talk about Heidegger at the beginning in really wonderful ways, is about the ability to truly relate to the world. Well, the funny thing is, in finitude, the very possibility of true infinity comes out because there's an incompletion into which we can step into things per se and complete that incompletion, but only in the terms of a relation. And so that focus on one tree I find, I think really gets at the ways that we need to think about finitude as an invitation. So limit is invitation. I also really appreciate in chapter 4 where he goes on the comments on selected poems. I think this is really nice. He doesn't do all the poems, but he does enough of the poems to give you a flavor of ways to go about interpreting the work, to think about the work, and to be more deeply engaged with it. like that one poem I just read. He says, one theme that ran through my work was the discovery of the effulgence of meaning in the world and the corresponding privilege that finite life enjoys and the continual excavation of that meaning. So again, those are the themes of finitude, the fact that life has meaning, but that meaning is meaningful precisely because we approach it in terms of finite. If we were infinite, then the meaning of everything would be present per se. It would all be there and thus become meaningless, like a working doorknob, to allude to a Heidegger. We don't really notice a working doorknob. We notice a doorknob when it breaks, which means that notice and concern and focus can come out precisely because of a kind of brokenness. And although I'm not trying to say finitude is brokenness, there's a similar sort of ever changing in our relation to or discovering something different about a thing that thus makes the meaning it could potentially have be meaningful. Mr. Stanley writes, I realize that because of my smallness, the world could never be boring. I really like that. That's again suggesting that smallness is a wonderful gift. We make a mistake to think of smallness as a limitation, as we make a mistake to think of limitation as a limit. Yearning silently, there is more meaning in me than one life could hold. Though I choose to move forward, I will mourn what never was. This is another poem by Mr. Stanley, and I think here, too, we're kind of invited to recognize in one poem that finitude is an invitation, but that there's also kind of a necessary grief or sorrow that finitude brings, because we have to think of everything that never was, right? There are things that we'll never have that we could have had, but you see this very grief, the ability to work through grief makes possible a certain deepening of the human spirit that otherwise would never occur. So the grief is a deepening that has something very powerful to it that adds to human life. And, there's a way to think about finitude as the possibility for depth, not just distance. The more we think in terms of the spurious or adding or going, there's something that's kind of distance-based about it. We're going to the next tree. The possibility of depth is found in the one tree that we really pay attention to. And that one tree becomes an invitation to a relation. So I think the poetry collection begs the question on if we can imagine infinity as deep without finitude. It would seem that finitude is the prerequisite for infinity to be deep and not just a matter of distance. And I like the phrase, there is more meaning in me than one life could hold, which is beautiful because it has this, when you read that, there's kind of this bursting, meaning is bursting out of me. But then that is met at the end where it says, I will mourn what was never was. So there's a kind of idea that you imagine someone bursting with meaning and it's like, wow, they're so supercharged, they're so alive. But actually the meaning that bursts out of us is at the same time lost. And this is the kind of double move, the kind of tragedy of finitude that is also its beauty. And I think thinking beauty and tragedy together is very, very difficult. And Mr. Stanley does it with incredible dexterity through his work. And it's also lovely to think there is more meaning in me than one life could hold. That kind of suggests a certain participation in an infinity, but in a positive way, a kind of eternity. Precisely because how could so much meaning be located in something that can't hold it? That's a kind of miracle there, a kind of transubstantiation, a kind of water as wine that is being suggested, which is really, really, really nice. And in the commentary, he says, because of our finite finitude, we cannot choose every path to be actual for us. We cannot float in the realm of possibilities forever, for not to act is to act. And so you have here again, we have to act, we have to choose possibility, but the very act of choosing X instead of Y then limits us from Y. But if we're always moving from X, Y, to Z, we never have that one tree with which we can have a true relation with. And you also see throughout Mr. Stanley's collection recurring terminology like unearthing. Like, I love the term unearthing that he uses because, again, unearthing means dig up, but it also kind of means the losing of earth. It is unearthed, finitude. So there's an unearthing meaning that is the taking away of meaning, but it is also the discovery of meaning. And so that phrase right there, unearthing meaning, is like, in my opinion, just a perfect phrase to get at the tragic yet beautiful relation of finitude with itself in terms of true relation and beauty. Unearthing meaning, the ongoing process of a man in tension. What do I do with this thing? For now, put it over there. And I think with that, there's part of, when you have a notion here, as Mr. Stanley talks about at the beginning, there's something about the power of Japanese poetry, the waka, as the poetic form, that has this household imagery, the putting on the shelf. There's a poem that I love about the cold tingle in the toes under the bed sheet. So it's locating so much in the home, in the daily life, which then automatically frames the poetry as being far more likely to participate in true infinity than spurious infinity. Because if we're always writing a poem about going somewhere with the ocean or going on an adventure, these all have a place, but it is just human nature in the discussion of distance to lose sight and connection with depth. And so if you limit yourself as a poet or a writer to the household, to the daily life, to the slice of life events, the probability of coming upon true infinity is much higher. Now, not necessarily, but there's something about that limitation that proves to not be a limit. In fact, it proves to be an invitation. And so, again, you have this image of unearth. What do I do with this thing? For now, put it over there. We put it back on the shelf. You have this idea of a bowl that you're just going to put back on a shelf. Likewise, we get this kind of, this is finitude. Oh my gosh, this is a great power, this great tension of this thing that unearths meanings, discovers meaning in the very act that threatens meaning. Let me put that on the shelf. I'm not going to think about that right now. But at the same time, for now, put it over there. The double meaning there is the idea that here's this finitude. What do I do with this incredible thing? Well, let's start by putting a bowl on the shelf. Let's start with something daily, something simple, because that act of simplicity is at the same time participating in this true relation, this infinite finitude. And so that poem right there just captures so much of the themes of the poetry. I also love where he described the story behind the one on hurtled amongst the rocks, our bodies held together, ringed about by snow, clinging to each other for warmth, though I had never known her. I love how he explains the story of this, but I will. You need to pick up the collection to go into to get that. I won't ruin it for you. And I was thrilled to learn that Mr. Stanley does so much hiking. I salute him. I love going. I've never done hiking to this level of skill. This impressive level of hiking, but I did enjoy getting lost in the mountains as a kid. And again, leaves strewn on the path. Once joyful dancers in light, now trod underfoot, becoming tomorrow's mulch. We shall all be one someday. I love the idea there of we all become one as mulch, as that which gives life to what comes after us. So there's a certain kind of unity in that, but there's also a certain tragedy of that. We are one because we're dead, and yet that death is life. Again, the themes and tragedy of finitude and beautiful brought together in incredible ways. I will read the first poem that starts chapter 3. Life in utero, origin at 21. Who is being born? An idol to these vain thoughts, a vessel built for service. I think that poem asks the question of all of us. Yeah, I very much appreciate it. More can be said about the collection. He goes, I really do appreciate, I found it fascinating where he was describing in chapter 2 the life of Saigyo, kind of these different poems. And this question also, what's very interesting is the way that Mr. Stanley, when he talks about history, blends it with philosophical consideration. So what is a good life? Well, a good life must therefore have a narrative arc within a time, place, and community. But how can we understand a good life? Should we treat people as a model to copy perfectly, or are there principles we have to find and locate? I think he explores that very well. And I just found it very interesting. It just wasn't, it wasn't boring. It was very engaging, but it wasn't also, there was an economy of detail, which is a skill that the poet requires, in my opinion, the economy of detail. And Mr. Stanley not only shows that in his poetry, but also in his historic analysis, which makes me quite excited for his book on silence, which will be coming out. And again, here he talks about how in the history of Japanese thought, some of the newer poetry lacked an emphasis on the mundane doings of common folk in the description of natural objects, which resonates so much with the Japanese spirit. So Japanese poetry kind of waned to the degree that it lost its binding principle in the slice of life episodes in which true infinity can be found. And this would suggest that perhaps the Japanese sensibility is more attuned to distinctions between the spurious infinity and the true infinity, and that there's a bit to be learned from the West. There's a bit to be learned by the West of the East in this regard. So I really, and he also has a tremendous reflection on Heidegger, talking about, and I think he makes it very clear ways we can think Heidegger and Japanese thought together. And I love this phrase here where he says, finitude does not, and so this is in the context, he talks about religion, but also Heidegger, and finitude does not encourage us to escape it. It invites us to embrace it as an adventure. And I think that sums up what the poetry collection inspires you to do. You read it, and then you see finitude as an adventure, because you see the one tree that, precisely because your eyes are not wide enough to see it in its entirety, there is always more to see. For more by Matthew Stanley, please visit Samsara Diagnostics. He has a wonderful blog, a wonderful website. Please sign up to be ready for his book when it comes out. Again, you can find Every Sunset is a Moonrise on Amazon. You can also find some of his discussions on Samsara Audio on YouTube. His podcast, he has wonderful conversations. He's a wonderful person to speak with. I've enjoyed every chance I've had to speak with him. And please check out Every Sunset is a Moonrise today.